Imagine the heaviest silence you could ever possibly experience. The gates of paradise have just violently closed. Adam and Eve, the very first humans, stand trembling on the cold, unforgiving earth outside the only home they have ever known. Behind them is the Garden of Eden, a realm of absolute perfection, a place of flawless harmony where they walked alongside the Creator himself in the cool of the day. But now, as they look back through tear-filled eyes, the entrance is completely blocked. It is not just a heavy wooden gate or a simple stone wall standing in their way. Blocking the path back to the Tree of Life are beings of unimaginable, terrifying power, the Cherubim, and with them, a blinding, flashing, flaming sword turning fiercely in every single direction. For thousands of years, this dramatic image has captured the imagination of humanity. On the surface, it sounds like the ultimate act of divine rejection, a permanent, hostile barrier erected between God and man. But what if everything you thought you knew about this specific moment is completely incomplete? What if I told you that this terrifying scene at the eastern gate of Eden was not just a symbol of wrath, but actually the very first act of an incredible, desperate rescue mission? To uncover the true mystery of the cherubim and the flaming sword, we must look past the surface of the Genesis account and dig deep into the ancient, profound realities of the biblical world. By the end of this journey, you will never read the story of the fall of man the same way ever again. First, we need to completely erase the image of cherubim that modern culture has handed down to us. When you hear the word cherub today, you almost certainly think of a chubby, cute, winged baby with a tiny bow and arrow floating peacefully on a cloud. This Renaissance artwork invention could not be further from the terrifying biblical truth. In the ancient scriptures, cherubim are not cute. They are majestic, overwhelmingly powerful, and deeply intimidating. Whenever human beings actually encounter these entities in the biblical text, their first reaction is almost always to fall face down in absolute, paralyzing dread. The prophet Ezekiel gives us a staggering, mind-bending description of the cherubim. He describes spiritual beings with 4 distinct faces: the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. They are covered entirely in eyes, radiating a blinding, unearthly light, moving like rapid flashes of lightning. Their massive wings sound like the deafening roar of rushing waters, or like the booming voice of the Almighty himself. They are the royal, elite guard of the heavenly throne room of God. Their primary function throughout the entire Bible is to bear the throne of the Creator and to fiercely, uncompromisingly protect his holy presence from anything impure or corrupted. So, when God deliberately places these specific, terrifying entities at the entrance of Eden, he is making a profound, earth-shattering statement. Eden was never just a beautiful botanical park. It was the original temple. It was the sacred cosmic space where heaven and earth completely overlapped, where the pure, holy presence of God dwelled, literally, on the earth. By placing the cherubim at the entrance, God was officially signaling that the garden was a holy sanctuary, and heavily corrupted, sinful humanity could no longer casually stroll into the presence of perfect holiness. The cosmic barrier was officially drawn. But the cherubim were not standing there alone. Beside these massive beings was the flaming sword, flashing fiercely back and forth. Some ancient translations call it a whirling sword of consuming flame. It was turning every way, actively blocking every possible angle of approach. You could not sneak past it. You could not fight your way through it. You could not reason with it. It was an impenetrable, dynamic barrier of divine fire. Fire, throughout the entire biblical narrative, heavily represents God's consuming holiness and his righteous, unavoidable judgment against sin. The sword itself represents the ultimate, fatal consequence of human rebellion. God had clearly warned Adam that the exact day he ate of the forbidden tree, he would surely die. The flaming sword was the physical manifestation of that absolute boundary between life and death. It boldly declared that the way back to the tree of life was now a path of strict judgment. Anyone who dared to try and reach the tree of life on their own terms, carrying the fatal disease of sin in their heart, would be instantly, completely consumed by the righteous fire of that sword. It was an absolute, terrifying, impenetrable barrier. Yet, hidden deep inside this terrifying display of judgment lies a profound mystery that completely flips the narrative of the expulsion. Why was God so fiercely determined to keep Adam and Eve away from the tree of life? Was he just angry? Was he punishing them out of pure divine spite? The answer is hidden in the very words of God recorded in the book of Genesis. God says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever." I want you to really think about those specific words. God is not speaking in a tone of vindictive, out-of-control rage. He is speaking with a heart of immense, protective grace. Think about the exact spiritual and physical condition of Adam and Eve at that very moment. They had just committed high treason against the Creator. Sin, toxic shame, heavy guilt, and spiritual death had just entered their very DNA. They were totally broken. Their bodies were now actively subject to decay, and their minds were permanently tainted by the dark knowledge of evil. If they had stayed in the garden and casually eaten from the tree of life, in that newly fallen, corrupted state, the results would have been catastrophically worse than physical death. They would have immortalized their own brokenness. They would have lived forever in a permanent, unending state of sin, eternal guilt, eternal physical decay, and eternal, agonizing separation from the true spiritual life of God. They would have literally become immortal prisoners to their own dark condition, locked away with absolutely no possibility of future redemption. It would have been a living, breathing hell on earth. Therefore, the terrifying cherubim and the whirling, flaming sword were not placed there merely to keep humanity out. They were strategically placed there to protect humanity from sealing its own eternal doom. The flaming sword was a deeply painful but absolutely necessary act of divine mercy. God was forcefully closing the door to the garden so that he could eventually, systematically open a much greater door to true, eternal redemption. He subjected humanity to physical death and expelled them into a harsh world of thorns and thistles, not to abandon them to the dark, but to give them time for a master plan to unfold. A plan that would not just temporarily gloss over their sin, but completely, permanently eradicate it. The terrifying barrier at the eastern gate of Eden created a massive open loop in the biblical story, a giant, burning, unanswerable question that hung over humanity for thousands of years. How will we ever get back to the tree of life? How can any human being ever bypass the terrifying cherubim and survive the consuming, flaming sword of God's holy justice? The spectacular answer to that question weaves its way beautifully through the entire Old Testament. Fast forward centuries later, when the Israelites build the tabernacle in the harsh wilderness, and later the grand, magnificent temple in Jerusalem. God gives them highly specific, architectural instructions for the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the exact place where his heavy presence visibly dwells. And what does God specifically command Moses to heavily embroider on the massive, impossibly thick veil that visually separates the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple? Cherubim, massive, intricate images of cherubim. Furthermore, golden statues of cherubim were placed directly on top of the Ark of the Covenant itself. Do you see the brilliant, intentional connection? The thick veil in the temple was a stark visual reminder of the eastern gate of Eden. It was a constant daily message to humanity. The way is still blocked. The cherubim are still fiercely guarding the presence of God. Sinful man cannot simply walk back in on his own merit. For centuries, the high priest could only enter that room once a single year, carrying the blood of an innocent sacrifice, trembling in absolute fear. The flaming sword of justice was still turning, demanding a perfect payment. But then comes the ultimate, breathtaking climax of the entire human story. On a dark, violent Friday afternoon, outside the city walls of Jerusalem, the ultimate Son of God hangs agonizingly on a rough Roman cross. He is entirely sinless, pure and perfect, yet he willingly takes upon himself the dark rebellion, the heavy guilt, and the complete brokenness of the entire human race. As Jesus breathes his final, agonizing breath, he loudly cries out, "It is finished." And at that exact precise microsecond, the Gospel of Matthew records a profound, earth-shattering, supernatural event. The massive, incredibly heavy veil in the temple, the very veil thickly embroidered with those terrifying cherubim, was violently torn in two pieces, completely from top to bottom. It was not torn by weak human hands from the bottom up. It was torn by the invisible hands of God himself from the heavens down. What does this profound moment actually mean? It means the flaming sword finally fell. But it did not fall on us. It fell directly on Christ. Jesus willingly walked into the fiery, consuming blade of divine justice so that you and I wouldn't have to. He took the fatal strike. The ancient, impenetrable barrier was finally broken. The cherubim stepped aside. Because of the perfect sacrifice of Jesus, the way back into the holy presence of God, the way back to the true tree of life, has been completely ripped wide open for everyone. This is exactly why the book of Revelation ends with the most beautiful, hope-filled promise imaginable. In the vision of the new heavens and the new earth, there is no more temple, there is no more veil, and there is absolutely no more flaming sword blocking the way. Instead, we see the crystal-clear river of the water of life. And right there, on each side of the river, stands the tree of life, bearing its fruit. And the ultimate promise is given to all who wash their robes in the blood of the Lamb, that they will permanently have the right to the tree of life and may freely enter through the open gates into the holy city. God's original perfect intention for humanity was never actually thwarted by the serpent. It was only strategically delayed, so it could be powerfully redeemed with an even greater, unimaginable glory. The terrifying cherubim and the deadly flaming sword were never your enemies. They were the fierce guardians of our future hope. They held the line of holiness so that the Savior could eventually come and do what we could never possibly do for ourselves. The story of Eden's locked gate is not a depressing tragedy of permanent exile. It is the brilliant, masterful, loving prologue to the greatest rescue story ever completely told. If this revelation changed the way you see the story of Genesis and the heart of God, let me know in the comments section below. What other deep biblical mysteries have you always wondered about and want us to uncover next? Make sure to completely subscribe to the channel to uncover more of the deep, hidden, transformational truths of the scriptures. And always remember, because of the cross, the way back home is no longer blocked.